Mike Ryan. Readers of Turquoise in America Part 2, which covers the time period 1910 to 1990, are familiar with the name Allan Voshall. Allan tells his story in Chapter 5, which I called First Contact, which tells the story of the introduction of Chinese turquoise into the U.S. market in the late 1980s. Recently, Allan and his wife Karen were in Santa Fe for Indian market, and we were able to get together and talk Chinese turquoise and a little bit about the involvement of Danny Lopacki and Allan's learning about bead making and a bit about the history of bead making in China. So it was a real interesting discussion, and I'm happy to be able to share that with you in 2 parts. So I hope you enjoy our discussion as much as Allan and I did. Well, hello, Allan. Welcome to Santa Fe. It's a pleasure to see you here again. It's been so nice to be able, through all our interactions with Turquoise in America, to develop a friendship out of this, and it's been a great pleasure. Happy to have you here. Today, we're going to talk not so much about the history of First Contact, which is found in Chapter 5 of Turquoise in America Part 2, but what happened after that. A little bit about the technique that was going on there at the time when you and Danny Lopacki were involved, and what the Chinese were doing with their turquoise, but then more importantly, what Danny and you did with that afterwards. So if you would, tell us a little bit about your meeting Danny and what was going on in China at the mine at that time.
Okay, well, thank you, Mike. I'm happy to be here. But we had originally gone to the mine just to discover, is there something here? It's not that we knew there was a whole bunch of turquoise there, we just needed to see it. And once we got there, we quickly discovered that there was a lot of turquoise there. And so we needed to get some of that turquoise purchased and bring it to the U.S. and see how the market here would respond to it. And so we did. We brought out, I think it was close to 300 pounds, hand carried it out. And the place we went to with it was to Danny Lopacki's house, just outside of Zuni and Gallup, where he was living at the time. And that's when I met Danny, on that day when we came to his house with all this turquoise. And we were in his shop, and he wanted to see all this turquoise we had brought, just to understand what we had. And we went outside and got a kiddie pool of his daughters and dragged this kiddie pool inside, and were able to dump all of the turquoise, the rough stone, into this kiddie pool. And out came the squirt bottles, and everybody's looking in there. It's maybe 4 or 5 feet, and quite full. And so this is Danny's first look at the Chinese turquoise, other than what he'd seen with a seller at Tucson for some calves. And he just had a great time digging through that. And as part of that, he took out a kilo of the best he could find and was going to make a strand of beads out of it. And he did. He sat down with that stone and started cutting on it, and then making it into bead blanks, and then spinning the blanks. And he made the full strand, maybe a 28-inch strand or so. Made the whole strand, I don't want to say in one sitting, but it was done within 2 days, which, and since then I've learned that's remarkable, and a beautiful strand it was. So at that point I realized Danny was a master craftsman, artist, and I also learned that I really liked beads. I didn't know that before then. And once I saw him, because I sat and watched him making these beads, and they just kept getting more and more beautiful by the moment. And my mind, I could see how the evolution and the process was going as he was working on them. And from that moment on, I became a bead collector right then.
Now, in China at that time, while you brought that out, the Chinese were making beads too, but it was a very different approach, wasn't it?
It was, and it's important to understand that, you know, they didn't have a market, a domestic market. And in that form of government, nobody had money. Nobody wears jewelry. There are no stores. Nobody has money. Nobody can sell. Nobody can buy anything. So there is no domestic market per se. So the idea of making jewelry at that mine and cutting shop, no, because you can't sell it to anybody. It would have to be exported, and individuals and work units within China weren't allowed to export either. They couldn't sell their items. They would have to then sell them somehow to these import-export companies, who then would go out and sell whatever their products were at friendship stores and airports within the communist bloc, and that was the full market. So it's important to realize that they didn't have the economic incentive that we have. They like to make beads, and the thing about beads is they don't take much machinery to make them. They can't, I mean, I use a lot of machinery to make mine, but the Chinese, it's something they could make without the investment of.
Now you mentioned Danny had, there's some terms there as far as he made the bead blanks.
Yes.
And then cut, and then
shaped
them, rounded them. Mm-hmm. And of course he's doing that with his machinery because Danny was a mechanic. Danny had helped set up, or later on he would help to set up the cutting shop. Mm-hmm. And that story is told again very well in part 2. But the Chinese didn't have that. So how did they manage to cut their beads?
And you know, because they didn't have access to technology, diamond tooling, electricity, things like that we take for granted, everything they made had to be made more or less by hand. And by hand, I mean they could use treadmills and that type of thing, and there was a certain amount of electricity being used then. But example, beads, ball beads, which I know a lot of people are quite familiar with how many ball beads came out of China, or just balls, and that they can be made without an investment. All you need to do is kind of make a table and have a way to suspend a stick on it that's cupped on one end and stuck inside something here, and then with a treadmill you can spin it. You know,
so people can think of a spinning wheel.
Yeah, that's right, just like a spinning wheel. Mm-hmm. And so while the foot is going up and down, it's spinning this piece back and forth like that. And there's a cup on this end, and you can just take a piece of a block, a square, a semi-round turquoise, and stick it onto that with a tree pitch or anything like that. And then as it's spinning, then with your hand, you can like, I don't have to hold that. With one hand, they're drizzling grit, and with the other hand, they're shaping, allowing it to shape that ball. And that's how the bead is made. And it's obviously time-consuming to do it that way. So if you have a turquoise mine that you can't sell the products from, you're inclined to make your beads out of soft material because it's a lot faster. And that soft material then can be just put in and boiled with some oil or paraffin to give it that color. So many people I know have bought Chinese ball beads thinking, well, I can just cut them in half and I'll make caps. And then you cut into it and it's all white inside. That's how that happened.
Yeah.
Because that's just the level of technology there at the time. And they were learning that there was technology out there. They would like to have had access to diamond tooling, grinding wheels, bits, and all that stuff. Because I have to tell you, when they drilled those holes, it was a nail that had been pounded out. That bit had been handmade and put in something with a treadmill, and that's how the beads were.
Well, that was one thing I found really fascinating about your story, which is yours and Danny Lopacki, Ron Alexander, and some of the others who were involved in that effort. Of course, we think of it for the benefit to the U.S. turquoise market, where all of a sudden all this wonderful dark web turquoise came to market that had become unavailable, and all of a sudden here it was at a very inexpensive price. And we think of it in that way, but for the Chinese, it really contribution you guys made to educating them about the market, setting up the cutting shop, all of that. I think that's kind of an overlooked part of that whole history, although at the Turquoise Museum, which is now at the location of the old mine, and they have a photo of Allan there because you kind of remained in their memory because you spoke Chinese. And you were the interpreter.
We have ongoing conversations even now between me and the people up there. And so many of the people that I now communicate with are the sons and grandsons and nieces and nephews of the people that I'd worked with. You know, so there's a whole new generation. It's been almost 40 years now.
Yeah.
So it's been quite a while ago. But, you know, in terms of the economics of what they had to deal with, they had nobody to sell their products to. When we came to America and brought this stone, everybody is thinking cabochons. How many cabochons can I get out of this? Or why do you bring rough? Why not just bring cabochons? But that's where the market is here primarily. The Chinese didn't make cabochons. Cabochons mean you're putting it in jewelry. Jewelry means that you have a domestic market of people who can wear jewelry. But when you live in a world where there is no money, there are no stores, no one can buy, no one can sell, and the last thing you want to do is stand out in the crowd.
That was not wise ideology-wise in Maoist
It
China.
Absolutely was not. So there was no reason to be making cabochons. And they were surprised to find out that that was a big part of the American market. So then the question became, should we just export rough, or should we open a cutting shop here and do cabochons? Obviously, we couldn't teach them much about making beads, you know, because they had a long history of it. But in terms of what the Western market might like, which primarily was cabochons at that point, we had to import the tooling for that. And we did, and then built the shop.
That's a great part of the story, because that was carried by hand and back, and just a very great part of the story. And I encourage our viewers, if you haven't read that, Chapter 5 in Turquoise in America, Part 2, it's really a great story.